3 months after my husband died, I bought myself a used car. It was a practical little thing, a gray Honda Civic with 22,000 miles on it, and I paid $14,500 cash from the savings Bernard and I had been building since before our son was in diapers. The day I drove it home, I sat in the driveway for a long time just listening to the engine cool down. I put my hands on the steering wheel and thought, this is mine, I am still here. The next morning, my son came over before I had finished my first cup of coffee. He walked in without knocking, he still had a key, and he picked my car keys right up off the kitchen counter like they were his to take. He told me I was too old to be driving alone. He told me he and his wife had a family trip coming up, a whole week, and that his truck needed brake work. Then he told me not to worry, because he could drop me off at a memory care facility on the way. He knew of a good one. Very clean. Nice staff! I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just stood there with my coffee mug in both hands and listened to my son tell me that my life was over. He left with my keys. He left with my car. And then I picked up my phone, opened an app, and pressed one button. 14 miles down the highway, my Honda Civic rolled to a complete stop. My son called me 7 times in a row. I didn't answer a single one. Then I sent him one text message. Check the glove box. But to understand why I was ready, why I had been quietly, carefully ready for weeks before it ever happened, I have to start at the beginning. My name is Iris. I am 67 years old, and I spent 41 years married to the best man I ever knew. Bernard wasn't flashy. He wasn't the kind of man who made grand speeches or arrived with flowers for no reason. He was the kind of man who fixed the leaky faucet before you asked, who remembered how you took your coffee without ever being told twice, who held your hand in the car, even after 30 years of driving the same roads together. We met at a church potluck in Raleigh in 1982, when I was 24 and he was 26, and neither of us was looking for anything. I never looked at another man after that. We had one son, Gregory. We raised him in the house where I still live, a 4-bedroom colonial on a quiet street with a magnolia tree in the front yard that Bernard planted the spring Gregory was born. We weren't wealthy people. Bernard worked in logistics management. I taught 3rd grade for 28 years before I retired. We were comfortable, careful, and mostly content. We saved what we could and didn't spend what we shouldn't. By the time Bernard had his heart attack, sudden without warning, no chance for a proper goodbye, we had the mortgage paid off, about $230,000 in a joint savings account, and a list of things we still planned to do together. He was gone inside of 4 hours. The grief that came after is hard to explain to anyone who hasn't lived inside it. It isn't sadness exactly. Sadness sounds too thin, too manageable. It's more like a new gravity. Everything weighs more. Every room of the house where we had spent our life together held a different version of him. And I walked through all of it, like someone learning to move in a body that had forgotten how. Gregory came to the hospital that night. He stayed through the funeral. He helped me sort through the initial paperwork, and I was grateful, truly grateful, in the way you are when someone shows up in the worst hours. I held on to those early days of kindness like a rope over water. But Daphne was there too. My daughter-in-law had never been openly unkind to me. She was never rude, exactly. She was something harder to name than rude. Appraising, that is the word. She moved through my house the way a real estate agent moves through a property. Her eyes pausing at the fireplace, the renovated kitchen, the original hardwood floors throughout. At the reception after the funeral, she pulled me aside quietly, as if offering a favor, and asked whether Bernard and I had updated our estate documents recently. Whether I had thought about what I'd do with a house this size now that I was alone. Whether I had considered the practicalities of home maintenance at my age. My husband had been dead for 11 days. In the weeks that followed, Gregory began asking similar questions. Conversational, gradual. What were my plans for the savings? Had I spoken to a financial advisor? Did I know how expensive repairs got on an older home? He mentioned, twice, on separate occasions, that he and Daphne had been looking at investment properties and that additional capital could really open some doors for them. I listened. I smiled. I said I would think about it. And then I drove to see Lawrence. Lawrence had been Bernard's closest friend since their college days at NC State. He was a retired estate attorney, early 70s now, with a kind of quiet steadiness that made you feel more anchored just by sitting across from him. I called him 3 weeks after the funeral, and he said come whenever. I went that same afternoon. I told him everything. The comments at the reception. Gregory's casual financial questions. The particular way Daphne's eyes moved through my rooms. The feeling I couldn't quite name. Something uneasy and low in my stomach, telling me that my son and his wife were looking at my life and seeing an asset to be managed rather than a person to be loved. Lawrence didn't tell me I was overreacting. He set down his pen and said, "Iris, the best time to build a fence is before you need it." We spent 2 hours that afternoon building the fence. He helped me draft a notarized affidavit stating clearly that I was in full possession of my mental faculties, not experiencing cognitive decline, and that any attempt to have me declared incompetent would be legally contested. He attached a copy of my most recent physical, which showed I was in excellent health. He drafted a letter on his firm's letterhead explaining that my Honda Civic, purchased solely in my name, title registered solely in my name with the North Carolina DMV, was my legal property, and that any person who took it without my explicit written consent was committing grand theft auto, a felony under state law. He also helped me update my will. That was the hardest part of the afternoon. In the original will, the one Bernard and I had made together 15 years before, Gregory was the primary heir. The house, the savings, all of it. We hadn't revisited it because we trusted, the way parents do, that love would be sufficient. That everything we had built would naturally be held carefully by the child we had raised carefully. But sitting across from Lawrence, I thought about Daphne's eyes on my hardwood floors. I thought about Gregory asking about capital for investment properties while I was still learning how to sleep alone, and I understood something that I should have understood sooner. I had been confusing inheritance with love for a very long time. I removed Gregory from the will. The house would go to a land trust, converting it to affordable senior housing. Something Bernard would have genuinely loved. The savings would be divided between our local food bank, a children's literacy organization, and the Humane Society of Wake County, where Bernard had volunteered every Saturday morning for 11 years without fail. Lawrence filed the updated documents with the court that same week. The last thing we discussed was the car. When I had bought the Civic, the salesman walked me through an app, a connected services feature that let you lock and unlock remotely, track the vehicle's location, and in this trim package, activate remote engine immobilization if the car was ever stolen. I had set it up the night I drove it home, mostly because Bernard always said to read every manual and use every feature you paid for. I mentioned it to Lawrence almost as an afterthought. He looked at me for a moment and said simply, "Good, keep that app." I assembled everything Lawrence had prepared, the affidavit, the title copy, his formal letter, the updated will, into a large sealed envelope. I had 2 certified copies made at a FedEx store on the way home. One went to Lawrence's office. The other I tucked into the glove box of my Civic, held closed with a binder clip. Part of me hoped with everything I had that I would never need it. For 3 weeks, nothing happened. I planted geraniums on the front porch. I started walking in the evenings. I called my old college roommate Betsy, out in Asheville. We had let the years put distance between us, and we talked for 2 hours about nothing important and everything that mattered. I was beginning to feel, carefully and tentatively, like a person who might have a future. Then Gregory called one morning and said he and Daphne were nearby and wanted to stop by. They arrived 20 minutes later. I was still in my robe with my coffee. Gregory walked in ahead of Daphne with the particular expression he'd had since boyhood when he had done something wrong and was working on the framing. Chin slightly forward. I switched off mine. He talked for several minutes, about my age, about the house, about loneliness, about how they worried, about communities that were nothing like old nursing homes, really more like resorts, very active social calendars, wonderful staff. He had already looked up a specific one. Sunrise Commons in Cary, 45 minutes from their house, very clean, nice location. Daphne sat beside him, nodding at intervals like a second opinion that had already been purchased. When he finished, I asked him whether there was anything else. He glanced at Daphne. She gave a small nod. There was the matter of the car, he said. His truck needed brakes. He and Daphne had a trip planned to the Outer Banks. Her parents were involved. It had been in the works for months, though I had never heard a word about it. And my Civic was newer and more reliable. He would just borrow it for the week. And on the way he could take me by Sunrise Commons, just for a tour. I looked at him across the kitchen table where he had done his homework every evening for 13 years. I thought about the 19 days he had not called after his father's funeral. I thought about Daphne asking about estate documents at the reception. I thought about all the small, quiet moments when I had swallowed what I wanted to say and smiled instead, and how much that habit had ended up costing me. I said, "No." He blinked. "No, that is my car. It is registered in my name. I bought it with my own money, and I am not lending it to you." The room shifted. He stood up. He was 8 inches taller than me, and he knew it. He said my safety was more important than my feelings about independence. He said he was doing this for me. He said sometimes family had to make difficult decisions for the people they loved. Then he walked to the kitchen counter and picked up my keys. "Gregory," I said, "do not touch those keys." He picked them up. "I am calling the police," I said. He paused for 1 or 2 seconds, long enough that I thought he might reconsider, long enough that I saw something flicker in his face, and then he said I wasn't thinking clearly, and that was exactly why this needed to happen, and he walked to the front door. I dialed 911. I told the dispatcher that my son had just taken my car without my permission, and I needed an officer at my address. The dispatcher asked me to stay on the line. Gregory had already backed down the driveway by the time I hung up. I sat down, I breathed. I opened the app on my phone. I could see the Civic as a small blue dot moving northeast on Six Forks Road. I watched it travel. I finished my coffee. I let him get 14 miles down the highway, far enough that he would feel the distance, far enough that the panic would have time to start setting in. Then I pressed the immobilize button. The blue dot stopped. I set the phone on the table, poured myself more coffee, and thought about Bernard, who used to say that patience was just courage with better manners. The phone began ringing. Gregory, then Gregory again, then Daphne, then Gregory. I let it all go to voicemail. Then I sent one text. "Check the glove box." The texts started arriving 12 minutes later. "Mom, what is this? What does this mean?" Then, "Who is Lawrence Abbott? Why is our name not in the will? Mom, please call me." Then, after a long silence, "Mom, I didn't know you had a lawyer. I didn't know any of this. Please don't call the police. I'm coming back." I reactivated the engine remotely. I sent back one text, "Come back to the house." A police officer arrived while Gregory was still on the highway, a woman around 40, calm and professional, with a notepad and a manner that made me feel less alone. I showed her the registration in my name. I showed her the screenshot of my 911 call. She asked if I wanted to file a report. I said I would let her know after I spoke to my son. I asked if she would wait in her cruiser at the curb. She agreed without hesitation. Gregory pulled back into my driveway 40 minutes later. He got out of the car slowly, and I noticed immediately that Daphne was not with him. He had apparently dropped her at her parents' home on the way back, or she had refused to come, or some combination of both. That single absence told me nearly everything I needed to understand about the structure of their marriage. He walked up the porch steps and rang the doorbell. He had not rung my doorbell once in his entire adult life. I let him stand there for a moment, and then I opened the door. He was pale, his shoulders curved inward. He was holding the sealed envelope from the glove box in both hands, and his hands were not steady. "Mom," he said, "I'm sorry." I told him to come inside. I told him to sit down. I went to the kitchen and poured us both glasses of water. Not because I wanted water, but because I needed a moment, and because giving someone a glass of water is what you do when things are serious and you don't want to lead with anger. We sat across from each other at the kitchen table where he had grown up, and I let the silence settle between us before I spoke. I did not yell. I am not a person who yells. I just told him the truth plainly, which turned out to be harder than yelling and more necessary. I told him I had raised him for the first 5 years of his life almost alone, while Bernard worked nights and doubles to get us financially stable, and that I had done it without complaint because that was what was needed. That I had attended every school play and argued with every teacher who underestimated him and driven hours to his college campus when he'd been ready to quit his junior year, and sat with him for an entire weekend until he found his own reasons to stay. That after his father died, after the man who had been my partner and my companion, and the person I had planned to grow old beside was taken from me without a single chance to say goodbye. My son had come to the funeral and gone home, and had not called me for 19 days. That I had counted the days, every single one. I told him I understood that Daphne had influence over him. but that he was 44 years old and the words that had come out of his mouth in my kitchen that morning had come out of his not hers. That when you tell your mother she doesn't need her car, you are telling her she doesn't need her independence. That when you suggest a memory care facility to a woman who is still learning how to live with grief, you are telling her that her grief looks inconvenient from the outside. He cried. He covered his face with his hands, and part of me, the part that will always be his mother, regardless of anything, wanted to reach across and take his hands in mine. I kept my hands folded in front of me instead. What I need from you, I said, is not apologies. Apologies are the cheapest currency there is. What I need is time and visible change, real change, not promises. He nodded. I told him the will remained as filed. That was not a punishment. Punishment implies I want him to suffer, and I don't want that. I never wanted that. It was a reflection of what I had observed in the months since Bernard died, and I was not willing to leave everything we had built together in the hands of someone who had shown me twice that my well-being ranked below his wife's plans. If he rebuilt my trust genuinely, and over time, I would revisit it. But it would take actions, not words, and it would take the kind of time that couldn't be rushed. I told him I wanted him in individual therapy, not couples counseling, not a weekend retreat. Individual therapy because he needed to understand, with help from someone trained to help him understand, why he had walked into his mother's house and picked up her keys like they belonged to him. He said he would go. He said he would find someone by the end of the week. I told him I hoped he meant it. I walked him to the front door. He saw the police cruiser still parked at the curb and looked back at me. I'm not filing a report today, I said. I am keeping that option for as long as the law allows. Consider today a courtesy I am extending exactly one time. He nodded. He looked smaller than he had in years. I didn't know you had it in you, he said. Not cruelly, just honestly, the way you say something when you are genuinely surprised. I know, I said. That was as much my fault as yours. He left in a taxi he called from the driveway. My gray Civic sat right where it belonged. Daphne called my cell that evening. I let it ring through to voicemail. She left a message telling me I had humiliated her family, that Gregory was devastated, that I had always been difficult, and that I should reflect on what kind of mother treated her son the way I had treated mine. I deleted it without saving it. I had nothing to say to Daphne that would change who she was, and I had spent enough years trying to manage her opinion of me to last several lifetimes. That night I called Betsy. She listened to everything without interrupting once, which is what you can do when a friendship goes back 4 decades and trust has been established the long way. When I finished, she said, Iris, I have been waiting for this version of you for a very long time. I laughed, the first real laugh in longer than I could track. We made plans. She was in Asheville, about 3.5 hours west on I-40, through the foothills and up into the Blue Ridge. She had a guest room, a hiking group that met Saturday mornings and welcomed beginners without judgment, and a weekly neighborhood potluck where she said I was already considered invited. I drove myself. 3 hours and 20 minutes, door to door, on a clear Friday morning when the mountains were just beginning to go gold at the edges. I drove my gray Honda Civic with the windows cracked and Bernard's old road trip playlist on the Bluetooth, something I had set up in the first weeks after he died, when I needed his taste in music filling the car even if I couldn't have him in the passenger seat. I drove past the foothills and into the long curves of the mountains, and somewhere around mile 180, something loosened in my chest that had been held tight since November. I thought about Bernard, who used to say that the road looks different when you're not trying to get somewhere fast. I thought about Lawrence, who had called me brave in his office when I did not feel remotely brave, only exhausted from pretending to be fine. I thought about Gregory, who still had the chance to become the son I had raised him to be, if he chose to do the work. I thought about all the years I had made myself smaller to avoid taking up too much space in my own life, and how strange and right it felt to simply stop. Betsy was waiting on her porch when I pulled up. She looked exactly like herself, grayer, fuller, smiling with every part of her face the way she always had. She hugged me hard, and I let myself be held for a moment without worrying about whether I was being too much. You good? She said when she stepped back. Getting there, I said, and I meant it. Not healed, not finished, not the same woman I was before I lost Bernard, and not the same woman I was before my son walked into my kitchen and picked up my keys. But getting there. on my own terms, at my own pace, moving forward the way Bernard always said I eventually would. He knew me better than I knew myself. He always did. Some mornings now, I sit at the kitchen table with my coffee, and I watch the light come through the window and land on the magnolia tree he planted the year our son was born. And I think about what it means to have built a life. Not to have been given one, not to have been permitted one, but to have built it. With your own hands and your own money, and your own hard-won understanding of what you will and will not allow. My car is in the driveway. My name is on the title, my will is filed with the court, my lawyer has my number, and I have his. Nobody is going to take any of that from me again.